Top 10 U.S. prisons with the highest murder rates. The killing doesn't stop at the gates. Inside an American prison, violence does not always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it begins with an argument over a phone. Sometimes with a debt. Sometimes with a rumor. And sometimes the victim never sees it coming. A prison can have walls 10 meters high, armed officers, cameras, locked doors, and layers of security, yet inside those walls, another system can exist almost completely out of sight. A system of alliances, debts, reputations, fear, and, in some facilities, murder. But there is an important fact that often gets lost in sensational stories about America's most violent prisons. So tonight, rather than inventing statistics, we're examining 10 American prisons whose documented histories reveal some of the darkest realities of lethal violence behind bars. And the deeper we go, the more complicated the question becomes. Because what makes a prison dangerous isn't simply the number of murders. It's what happens before the murder. Who controls the housing units? Who decides whether an inmate is protected? What happens when staff lose control? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the people inside realize that the rules written on paper are not necessarily the rules that govern the cell block? Number 10, New Mexico State Penitentiary. Today, the old New Mexico State Penitentiary is remembered less as an ordinary prison and more as the site of one of the bloodiest prison uprisings in American history. On February 2, 1980, control inside the facility collapsed. The prison held roughly 1,100 inmates, even though the facility had originally been built for far fewer. Contemporary reporting described overcrowding, tensions between prisoners and staff, and serious concerns about prison administration. Then the inmates took control. Guards were captured. Cell blocks were opened. Fire spread. And for approximately 36 hours, the prison became a battlefield. The most horrifying violence occurred inside the prison itself. Inmates suspected of being informants were targeted. Others were killed during conflicts that had little to do with the original demands of the uprising. By the time authorities regained control, 33 inmates had been killed and more than 200 people had been injured. The violence was so severe that even years later, National Guard personnel who entered the facility described memories of recovering burned and mutilated bodies. But the most important lesson from New Mexico was not simply that prisoners could kill each other. It was that a prison can become extremely dangerous when institutional control disappears. Inside a functioning prison, every movement is supposed to be regulated. Doors open when officers authorize them. Inmates move when they are ordered to move. Weapons are supposed to be controlled. Information is supposed to move through official channels. During the riot, those systems broke down. And when the formal system disappeared, another system took its place. Prisoners organized themselves. Groups established control. Some inmates sought protection. Others became targets. And people who were already vulnerable became even more vulnerable. The old penitentiary eventually became a symbol of what happens when overcrowding, poor conditions, institutional failures, and uncontrolled violence collide. But if New Mexico shows what happens when prison authority collapses completely, our next prison demonstrates something different. A place where violence has remained a recurring concern even when the institution itself is still operating. Number 9, St. Clair Correctional Facility. In Alabama, the St. Clair Correctional Facility has spent years appearing in discussions about serious prison violence. A federal court record discussing conditions at the facility cited reports describing significant inmate-on-inmate violence in Alabama prisons during the early 2010s. One cited report placed St. Clair ninth among Alabama's 10 most violent prisons in 2011 and reported that 2 inmates were murdered there that year. That number may sound small until you understand the environment. A prison housing hundreds of men does not function like a city. There are no ordinary escape routes. People eat together, sleep in close proximity, exercise together, trade goods, borrow things, build alliances, and settle disputes in an environment where everyone knows that showing weakness can carry consequences. The informal rules of prison can become just as important as official regulations. An inmate may owe another prisoner money. Someone may have borrowed something and refused to return it. A conflict outside the prison may continue inside. A gang affiliation can create enemies. And a dispute that would have ended with a verbal argument on the outside can become something much more serious behind concrete walls. That does not mean every prisoner is violent. Far from it. Most prisoners are simply trying to survive their sentences. But a small number of highly violent individuals can have an enormous impact on everyone around them. And when staffing problems, overcrowding, or poor supervision enter the equation, the danger can increase. The question becomes, How much violence can a prison absorb before violence becomes part of the institution's daily culture? And Alabama would eventually confront that question repeatedly. At our next prison, the problem becomes even more complicated because this is not simply a facility associated with violent inmates. It is also one of the most recognizable prisons in the American South. Number 8. William C. Holman Correctional Facility. William C. Holman Correctional Facility has a distinctive place in Alabama's prison system. The facility opened in 1969 and has historically housed death row prisoners and other high-security inmates. Alabama Department of Corrections identifies it as a closed custody facility and notes that it has housed minimum through closed custody prisoners. That mixture creates a particularly difficult correctional environment. Some prisoners are serving decades. Some are serving life sentences. Some have been convicted of extremely serious violent crimes. And some are waiting for execution. But Holman's reputation cannot be reduced to the crimes committed by the people incarcerated there. The real question is what happens when large numbers of high-risk prisoners are placed inside a tightly controlled environment. Every movement matters. Every confrontation matters. Every security decision matters. An officer cannot simply walk away from a conflict. An inmate cannot simply leave the building. And when a violent incident happens, the consequences can spread quickly through a housing unit. Holman has also been the site of inmate deaths investigated by Alabama corrections officials, although individual deaths cannot automatically be classified as homicide. In one case, for example, officials stated that no foul play was suspected while the cause of death remained pending. That distinction is important. A prison death can be tragic without being murder. And that is precisely why reliable prison statistics are so difficult to interpret. But the facility's high-security mission tells us something about the environment. These are people whom the state has classified as requiring significant security controls. And inside such a facility, survival often depends on understanding boundaries. Who to associate with, who to avoid, when to speak, when to stay silent, and when a conflict begins, how quickly to get away from it. Because in prison, the person who starts a fight isn't always the only person in danger. Sometimes everyone standing nearby becomes part of the problem. Number 7. Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman. Parchman is one of America's most historically significant prisons. Mississippi State Penitentiary, commonly known as Parchman Farm, dates back to the early 20th century. Its history is inseparable from the history of punishment in Mississippi. For decades, prisoners were used as agricultural labor. The prison became infamous for harsh conditions and institutional violence. But Parchman's modern story is different from its historical reputation. The prison still operates as a major correctional institution, but the problems associated with violence have evolved. Prison violence rarely exists in isolation. It can be connected to staffing, gang activity, contraband, overcrowding, mental health problems, drug markets, personal disputes, and the enormous pressure created when people with very different backgrounds are forced to live together under confinement. A prisoner's day may begin before sunrise. Count. Breakfast. Work or institutional assignment. Movement. Another count. Lunch. Recreation. More movement. Dinner. Lockdown. Final count. Then the doors close. But beneath that routine, another world may continue. Information travels. Debts remain. Threats are remembered. And alliances matter. The survival rule in a dangerous prison is often not complicated. Do not attract unnecessary attention. Do not involve yourself in other people's conflicts. And never assume that a dispute has disappeared simply because nobody is talking about it. Because inside a prison, silence does not necessarily mean peace. Sometimes it means someone is waiting. And at our next prison, the scale becomes enormous. We move south into Louisiana, where one of America's most famous correctional facilities has spent more than a century developing its own complicated culture. Number 6. Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola. Louisiana State Penitentiary is better known as Angola. It is enormous. The prison occupies a vast area of land in Louisiana and historically operated with extensive agricultural work. Unlike the image of a tiny concrete prison surrounded by a city, Angola resembles a settlement. There are roads, fields, housing units, work areas, religious facilities, and thousands of people living under the authority of the correctional system. That scale creates a unique challenge. The larger the prison population, the more difficult it becomes for officers to personally observe every interaction. And prison violence does not necessarily look like a dramatic riot. Sometimes it is one prisoner attacking another. Sometimes it is a dispute between people who already know each other. Sometimes a weapon appears where nobody should have had one. And sometimes the victim is discovered only after the violence is over. Historically, Angola has also been associated with prison violence, harsh punishment, and the difficult legacy of Louisiana's correctional system. But another important factor is the nature of long-term incarceration. When someone expects to spend decades inside a prison, the social world of the prison becomes their entire environment. Friendships become important. Reputation becomes important. Religion can become important. Work becomes important. And so can power. For some prisoners, the goal is not to dominate everyone around them. It is simply to make it through another year, another month, another night. But when a prison population includes people convicted of violent crimes and people serving life sentences, conflicts can become especially dangerous. The prison itself does not automatically create murderers, but it creates an environment in which people who already have violent histories live under enormous pressure and with limited options for separation. And when that pressure becomes lethal, the consequences can be permanent. Still, Angola is not the prison that defines America's image of extreme confinement. For that, we need to go west, to California, to a prison system that became famous for trying to control violence by separating people from one another. And that strategy produced its own consequences. Number 5, San Quentin. San Quentin is one of the most famous prisons in America. Its history stretches back to the 19th century. For generations, it housed some of California's most notorious prisoners. And because of its location beside San Francisco Bay, the prison has become almost instantly recognizable. But fame can hide complexity. San Quentin has held different populations over its long history, including death row prisoners and inmates serving long sentences. The prison's history includes murders, assaults, riots, and executions. But there is something important about looking at San Quentin through the lens of prison violence. The prison system does not simply contain violence. It also tries to manage it. Classification systems determine where prisoners are housed. Protective custody can separate vulnerable prisoners. Administrative segregation can restrict movement. Transfers can remove individuals from dangerous environments. And officers monitor housing units to prevent conflicts from escalating. But every protective measure has a price. If you isolate too many people, you create other problems. If you mix too many people together, you create different problems. And if officers do not have enough information, a dangerous conflict can develop faster than anyone realizes. Inside a prison, information is power. Officers need information about threats. Prisoners need information about what is happening around them. And both sides understand that information can be manipulated. A rumor can create fear. A false accusation can destroy someone's reputation. A perceived betrayal can turn an ordinary relationship into an enemy relationship. And once violence begins, the prison has to respond immediately. Because there is nowhere for the attacker or victim to simply disappear. This is why some of the most dangerous moments in prison occur not during major riots, but during ordinary routines. A shower period, a recreation yard, a meal, a cell extraction, a hallway movement. A few seconds can change everything. But California eventually developed an even more extreme response to prison violence. Instead of simply controlling prisoners through ordinary security, officials created a prison system designed around the idea of extreme isolation. And that brings us to Pelican Bay. Number 4, Pelican Bay State Prison. Pelican Bay was designed around a particular problem. How do you control prisoners believed to be capable of organizing violence from inside prison? California's answer included extreme segregation. The Security Housing Unit, or SHU, became one of the most controversial examples of prolonged solitary confinement in the American prison system. The logic was straightforward. Separate influential prisoners from the general population. Limit communication. Limit movement. Reduce opportunities to organize violence. But the consequences of extreme isolation became one of the defining controversies surrounding Pelican Bay. A prisoner could spend enormous amounts of time alone. Meals could be delivered through a slot. Exercise could occur in a small enclosed area. Human interaction could be dramatically reduced. And psychological pressure could become part of the punishment. This created a strange contradiction. A prison could become safer in one sense by making individual prisoners almost completely isolated. But the isolation itself became a subject of intense criticism and litigation. Pelican Bay demonstrates that prison violence is not simply a question of how many murders occur. It is also a question of how governments respond when they believe prisoners are dangerous. Do you separate them? For how long? Under what conditions? And what happens to a person who spends years in extreme isolation? Those questions became central to the debate surrounding California's prison system. And yet, even with extreme security, prison violence could not simply be eliminated. Because prisoners still interacted with one another. Staff still had to move people. Medical emergencies still occurred. And human conflicts continued. But the next prison on our list takes us into a different world. The federal system. And one of its most violent periods was not defined by one murder. It was defined by an atmosphere in which violence could become a form of authority. Number 3, USP Beaumont. United States Penitentiary Beaumont is a federal high-security prison complex in Texas. Like other high-security federal facilities, it houses prisoners considered to require intense security. The environment is built around control. Controlled movement. Controlled communication. Controlled access. Controlled housing. But control does not mean the absence of violence. In high-security prisons, many prisoners have long criminal histories. Some have histories involving serious violence. Others have powerful connections to criminal organizations. And the federal system has documented serious assaults and killings across its high-security institutions. The most important thing to understand about prison gangs is that they do not necessarily resemble the gangs people imagine from the street. Inside prison, organized groups can function around protection, money, contraband, information, and influence. A prisoner may join because he believes he needs protection. Another may join because he already has an affiliation outside. Another may simply understand that refusing an alliance could create problems. That does not mean every inmate belongs to a gang. Most do not. But where organized groups exist, violence can become strategic. It can be used to enforce debts, punish betrayal, control contraband, send warnings, or settle disputes. This is where prison survival becomes complicated. The official rules say one thing. The informal social rules may say another. And a prisoner who ignores either system can put himself in danger. But federal high-security prisons are not simply places where prisoners control everything. They are intensely monitored environments. Counts are frequent. Movement is restricted. Searches occur. Housing units are supervised. And federal investigators can pursue serious criminal conduct that occurs inside prison. The result is a constant struggle between control and adaptation. The prison tries to prevent violence. Prisoners adapt to the restrictions. Officials respond to those adaptations. Prisoners adapt again. It is a cycle. And sometimes, despite all the layers of security, someone dies. But if you want to understand one of the clearest examples of how prison violence can overwhelm an institution, there is one place we still have to visit. A prison whose history includes riots, gang warfare, staff shortages, deaths, and years of controversy. And it brings us to our final 2 entries. Number 2, Mississippi's most violent prison history. When people talk about violent prisons, they often imagine one extraordinary incident. But some institutions become notorious because violence appears repeatedly across years. That is the distinction between a prison with one deadly event and a prison system struggling with persistent violence. Mississippi's correctional system has faced repeated controversies involving overcrowding, understaffing, prison gangs, contraband, and inmate-on-inmate violence. And Parchman, already discussed earlier, became one of the most visible symbols of those problems. But this is where the phrase murder rate becomes especially dangerous. A prison with 2 murders among 300 prisoners can have a very different homicide rate from a prison with 10 murders among 3,000 prisoners. And a prison that experiences a single riot can produce more deaths in 2 days than another prison experiences over many years. Without comparable denominators, calling one facility number 1 can create a false impression of precision. The federal mortality system exists partly to solve this larger problem. BJS collects information about deaths in custody and can analyze causes of death and mortality rates. But even those datasets are not a simple leaderboard of every American prison. So instead of pretending that the data says something it does not, we should look at the underlying question. Where does prison violence become most dangerous? The answer is usually where several pressures collide. A large population, high concentrations of violent offenders, weak supervision, organized groups, contraband, overcrowding, poor infrastructure, and prisoners who believe the official system cannot protect them. When those conditions combine, violence can become self-reinforcing. A prisoner who does not trust officers may seek protection from other prisoners. Those groups become stronger. Stronger groups create more intimidation. Intimidation makes witnesses less willing to cooperate. Less information makes it harder for staff to prevent violence. And the cycle continues. That brings us to our final prison. Not necessarily because we can prove it has the highest mathematical murder rate in America. We cannot. But because its history illustrates one of the most important truths about prison violence. The most dangerous prison is not always the one with the most dangerous walls. Sometimes it is the one where control, fear, and violence become impossible to separate. Number 1, the prison where control collapsed. Our number 1 position is different. It is not a claim that this facility currently has America's highest homicide rate. There is no authoritative national dataset that supports that statement. Instead, it represents the most extreme documented example in this documentary of what can happen when violence inside a prison overwhelms the institution itself. The New Mexico State Penitentiary riot of 1980. Yes, we return to the prison that opened this story. Because the numbers tell only part of what happened. 33 inmates died. More than 200 people were injured. Officers were taken hostage. The prison was seized. And for approximately 36 hours, the formal authority of the state effectively disappeared from large parts of the institution. Imagine waking up inside a prison and realizing the officers no longer control the doors. The people around you have keys. Some have weapons. Others are trapped. Some prisoners are trying to protect themselves. Others are looking for enemies. And somewhere inside the chaos, people who were previously separated by rules are suddenly standing face to face. That is what made the New Mexico riot so terrifying. The prison did not simply become violent. The prison's normal structure stopped functioning. And once that happened, survival became a matter of allegiance, location, and luck. The story also reveals something uncomfortable about prison violence. It is easy to imagine violence as something that suddenly appears because violent people are placed together. But history repeatedly suggests a more complicated explanation. Prison violence can grow out of conditions: overcrowding, poor management, staffing problems, distrust, abuse allegations, contraband, gang conflicts, inadequate communication, and the belief among prisoners that formal authority is either unwilling or unable to protect them. When that belief becomes widespread, the prison can reach a dangerous threshold. People stop expecting the institution to solve their problems, and they begin solving those problems themselves. That is when the informal prison becomes more powerful than the formal one. And once that happens, restoring control can be extraordinarily difficult. If you found this story disturbing, remember that behind every statistic is a real human life and a family left behind. These prisons reveal just how complicated violence behind bars can be. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next story.